Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and it is my honor today to welcome you to the next installment of our Food for Thought series. And even though we are still virtual, we're able to come to you live from the Alabama Department of Archives and History's Farley Auditorium with Mr. Caver's presentation today. But before we begin, I have a few quick announcements. On Monday, November 1st at noon, we will have our next virtual research rundown on oral history, and that will be noon on our Facebook and YouTube channels. On Monday, November 8th at 11 a.m., the ADAH will have a dedication ceremony for two new busts depicting Alabama women, Patty Ruffner Jacobs and Amelia Boynton Robinson, in our statuary hall, and more details on that are to come. On Thursday, November 11th at noon, the next installment in our Alabama Women's History series will premiere, where archive staff member Haley Aaron will discuss World War I nurses. Finally, I'd like to invite you to join us again next month as our Food for Thought series continues with Jim Baggett's presentation titled The Attempted Lynching of Jim Brown. So today I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker, Mr. Joseph Caver. Mr. Caver is a lecturer in history at Alabama State University. He previously worked as an archivist at the ADAH and the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base. He's also the co-author of The Tuskegee Airmen, An Illustrated History, 1939 to 1949. And today's presentation is based on his new book, From Marion to Montgomery, The Early Years of Alabama State University, which is available in our online museum store. We're going to put a link down here, and you can buy both of Mr. Caver's books from our store. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Caver.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks to the staff for having me here. It is so ironic that the origin of this book starts in the basement of this building. Having graduated from Alabama State University in 1974, where we spent the whole year celebrating the centennial of the university, erecting the equinox and all types of program. So after graduating with a degree in history, of course, in 1974, jobs were limited. However, I did apply for a job here at the State Archives, and in December of 1975, I got my call, and 22 years old, one suit, and Milo B. Howard. So if anyone has been in Dr. Murray's office now, you go in that office, it's intimidating. So my knees were shaking. I get in, and Mr. Milo asks one question. If you had to do research on Alabama history, could you identify a source? And I blurted out, Owen's History of Alabama. Not knowing that Thomas Owen had founded the State Archives and had played a major role in preserving the history of the state. And so he said, that'll be all, one question. And I'm walking out of the chairs. He come running out. He said, hey, you want the job? That's how I became an archivist at the state here. And I was in charge of the Civil Archives Division downstairs, newspapers, governor's papers, of the Constitution Office paper. And getting to meet some of the premier historians working on Alabama history at the time, like Mills Thorne, Wayne Flint, Leah Atkinson, William Warren Rogers, Alan Jones. I know I'm missing some. But while providing reference service to one of Dr. Jones' graduate students, Helen Kitchen, she said, Joe, They got it all wrong over at Alabama State. The school was founded in 1867 instead of 1878. 4. She took me upstairs to the library, to the microfilm cabinet, and introduced me to the papers of the American Missionary Association. And lo and behold, I found the incorporation papers for the Lincoln School at Marion. Thus began the journey. So I'm working here and having access to all of these primary source documents. I decided to go back to graduate school to work on my Master's of Art, and I needed a thesis title. And I came up with Marion to Montgomery. So in 1982, I wrote my master's thesis. The university later would change the establishment date and memorialize the 9 Black men who incorporated the school at Marion. So that's the gist of this story. But while writing my thesis and having access to all of these primary source documents, it was a gem I still, at my age today, enjoy researching. And so the thesis were produced completed in 1982. But in 1981, I leave the state archives and go to Maxwell and get introduced to metadata. And one of the persons sitting here, one of my legacy is transitioning from paper to electronics, and of course, providing metadata to control the document. So I've spent a career working as an archivist, but thanks to this hire here, Milo Howard, never forget it. That's how I got into the profession, and it's been quite a journey. Now, back to the book. So I wrote the thesis in 1982. Dan Hallman, Jerome Ellens, and I did the illustrated history of the Tuskegee Airmen. We got to know all of the airmen and remember those days. And so Randall had read my thesis, Randall Williams of New South. He said, Joe, let's publish this. This is 2010, 2011. So here it is 10 years later. And I wanted to enjoy retirement. I didn't want to sit down and start a new book, but he kept pushing me. And of course, even at Maxwell, I maintained a relationship with historians like Ed Bridges, Millstone, and Randall Williams. So we would do lunch at least once a month and catch up on each other, who would research what's new topic. So he got me back to work. And what I did was take the thesis and start researching all over again to verify. And I uncovered some information that I hope, if you read the book, that you would enjoy. Those 9 Black men, they just didn't pop up. What I found that, like all of the, most, not all, can't say all, of the nearly 500,000 slaves, former slaves emancipated after the end of the Civil War, was looking for a means to advance in society. The Mobile Nationalists had already called for education, but it was these 9 Black men and Black women who held the fairs to finance the school in Marion. So all over the South, the Freeman Bureau is here. They've established common schools for Blacks and whites. Really, this is the beginning of a public education system in the state, even though the superintendent had been established in 1854. But you don't really get a public education system in Alabama until the Reconstruction period. So they wrote to Wager Swain requesting assistance. And they wrote to the American Missionary Association, which was the missionary arms of the Congregational Church. They had been acted in the antebellum period. The Amistad case stands out. And even during the war, they're trailing behind the Union Army, assisting the emancipated blacks. Started this first school in Athens, Alabama in 1865, the Trinity School. I think the building is still in existence. So these blacks in Marion, though, are unique because Marion was the cultural and educational center of the state. Had Howard College, Judson College, another school, Birmingham Southern, was over in Greensboro, but the Southern Baptist was entrenched in Marion. And because of this religious activity in particular, five of the Marion Nine learned to read and write before emancipation. One stand out, Alexander Curtis, was able to purchase his freedom for $2,000 in 1858. Now, Burtis English and I have had discussion about Mr. Curtis. It is said that he left the state and went to New York because the 1832 state law, the slave code, if you are emancipated, you have to leave the state. Curtis may have gone to New York, but his wife and he are still having children during the war. So either he's in New York or he's in Alabama. I suspect he's in Alabama. He pays income tax in 1865. But he was quite an entrepreneur, a barber, and was associated with the famous King family in Marion and Selma, William Rufus King, that family. So James Charles, who was introduced to me by ADAH child when I was working on my thesis. And we come to find out he's a mulatto. 5 of the 9 black men are mulattoes. That's how they claim in the 1866 state census and the 1870 federal census. So they wanted to form a school. Now, local whites, led by J.M.L. Curry, I think I got it right, they wanted to start a school for blacks because of the missionaries, the northern missionaries, the carpetbaggers are coming into the state for this purpose. That effort did not take off, so now it's left to the blacks there. So on July 18th, they produced the money, buy the land, and began construction on a new schoolhouse. But in January of 1867, the AMA sends a licensed certified teacher, Thomas C. Stewart, and voila, his grandson contacted me, and he had his great-grandfather's Civil War diary, correspondence with his 2 wives, corresponding with the E.C. Gravitt at Fisk University and the head of the American Missionary Association here in the South. But a brilliant man. He gets there, there's nowhere to teach. They start off in an old barn, but eventually the black men and women raised the money and opened the school. The AMA locates teachers, and the Freedmen Bureau pays for them to come to Alabama. And this is the origin of the school. So in 1869, this is the dedication of the building. And thanks to Sanford University for this photo, by the way. That's where it came from. Now, if you know, Sanford and Lincoln or Alabama State are closely related. Their histories are intertwined because both originate there in Marion and both leave Marion in 1887. Howard to East Lake Shore in Birmingham, and Lincoln to Montgomery. So Marion lose two institutions in 1887. We'll go into more details on that shortly. So Stewart is also serves in the Alabama legislature as a House member and as a Senate in an effort to raise money for this now private school. It's not a public school. He runs in all types of difficulties. He's visited by the Klan. It is a long story. Eventually, though, with the changing of politics in the state and the redeeming of the state away from the Republicans to the Democrats, Stewart is forced out of Marion. He tries to get a job in Selma. He's denied because of his political activism. He ends up in Birmingham, the new city, and become a member on the city council. His brother ran a grits mill in Birmingham. Now you got to remember, this is 1872. So Birmingham, the Magic City, is just beginning. He eventually reconnects with his mentor at Fisk University in Nashville. Kravitz had sent out the Fisk Jubilee Singers. They had entertained Queen Victoria, raised money to support the school and to build this huge structure, Jubilee Hall. It's on the National Register. So at first, Stewart and his wife on the faculty. Later, he's assigned as the building superintendent of Jubilee Hall. Once Jubilee Hall is completed, he resigned his commission with the American Missionary Association, moves to Chattanooga, started a keg and barrel business. He doesn't do very well. End up in Florida in the citrus business, and a frost wipes out his citrus crop. So now he's back in D.C. in the 1890s. He's still working in construction. He's the building superintendent of the old post office in Washington. Today is known as Trunk Hotel. This is Thomas C. Stewart. He dies in a railroad accident in Albany, New York, and he's buried in Delaware, Ohio. But that's Thomas C. Stewart. So now, back to Alabama. The Bourbons or the conservatives are taking over. The deal with Auburn receiving the land grant from the 1862 Act and the push by Blacks to integrate the schools, Peyton Finley, Alexander Curtis. So a compromise was reached that if you didn't push integration, we would finance higher education for Blacks. And this is what led to the establishment of the state-supported state normal school for colored students here in Marion and also in Huntsville, Alabama A&M. It was over the threat of integration, believe it or not, the compromise that was reached after the 1868 state constitutional convention. According to William Burns Patterson, it's 1869 when they were agreeing on the issue of education. But what I found out here, something similar with the Tuskegee Airmen. When we started working on the Tuskegee Airmen, the first thing we did was the 1925 War Department study. And that study said Blacks could not do complex tasks. They was not smart enough. They was coward. I'm saying, hold it now. It's the Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, every war that the country's been in, Blacks have served and served with distinction. But this 1925 War Department study said that, hey, we can't put these guys in airplanes. They're not smart enough. Plus, they're cowards. And so what we're finding out here with the development of the school is conservative whites determining what type of education these people would receive. They did not believe they could ascertain in higher education. So throughout this labeling as a college and university, it's in words only. When Patterson gets there in 1878, he starts a college division, but it's really just post-secondary. You got to remember now, with normal schools, this concept introduced in this country in the 1830s from Germany to produce teachers to tackle this vast pervasiveness of illiteracy. So after the Civil War, the same principle was applied to Black schools. They're called normal schools. Normally, you go through the primary schools and go up to the 8th grade. But Patterson went farther. He actually produced high school graduates and will be that way up until 1920, when it would become a 2-year institution, and in 1928 become a 4-year institution. But Burtis English, looked at the curriculum offered at Marion and at the University of Alabama. It was not that different. But the other thing I want to point out to you, and we'll talk more later, is the type of education advocated by Patterson in particular, and Booker T. Washington and William Hooper Council. Patterson was liberal arts all the way. Washington and Council went towards industrial agricultural development. And of course, you got to remember, with the ending of Reconstruction, white conservatives are in charge. And so Washington used it to attract philanthropy support from the industrialists, and of course, to placate the white Southerners. It's Patterson who's advocating liberal arts. Now, Tuskegee and A&M also had normal school. They were producing teachers, so it's not just focusing on industrial vocational education. So it's also classical. So I want to make that point to you. But Patterson in particular, that's his focus. Okay. School is function. Patterson Card is the first president when it became a state-supported institution. Patterson is working at a school called Tullibody over in Greensboro. And now his great-granddaughter and I have had this discussion, Judith. Why would Patterson become an educator? As you know, during Reconstruction, white teachers teaching at Black schools were targeted. I think the killing at White Plains is what led to the unveiling of the Klan and the first Klan. So teachers, and Patterson was ostracized because he's teaching Blacks to read and write. But he gets the school up and running. He's offered a job at Southern University, at Birmingham Southern now. He declined. He is industrialist. He's a carpenter. He's a florist. He's everything. But by the way, we also found out he started the first student newspaper at an HBCU in 1878, the Lincoln Reporter. According to the Library of Congress and the University of Alabama, no copies exist. But he bring that printing press to Montgomery, and he'll use it extensively when it gets here. So in December of 1886, a fire breaks out, and all of the citizens in Marion goes out to put the fire out, George Shivers. And on the way back, cadets from Howard, as you know, Howard was a military school, and students from Lincoln got into it. The Lincoln student would get off the sidewalk, one pull a knife, cut a cadet. Enough. But petition was started to remove Lincoln over this incident. It was a ruse. The state Baptist was discussing moving Howard away from Marion to more of an urban setting. The local white Baptists in Marion thought if they could get Lincoln out of Marion, they could save Howard. They weren't successful. And it was the conflict between the white Baptists, the state Baptists, that forced state Norma out of Marion to Montgomery. So we get to Montgomery. It's now the Colored People's University. It is supported by the governor, Reese, the mayor. It's the citizen that raised the money to buy the land. And of course, Centennial Hill is key to the relocation. You had the Swain School, now Booker T. Washington, but the Janetta Ditch at the base of Centennial Hill, the most prosperous Black community in Montgomery at the time. But it's due to the migration of ex-slaves from Autauga, Lowndes, Troy, to this little area. They couldn't come in downtown Montgomery because of the Black codes. So they set up this community, and this community grew and became middle class. You had politicians, you had business people. Victor Tulane, his building still stands on Ripley Street. Walked to Montgomery with $1 in his pocket from picking cotton and started this vast business. He was the first Black to serve on the Tuskegee Board of Trustees. Tulane Court is named after him. But you have this genre, and you got the school, the Swain School. You got the First Congregational Church. Remember that I told you about the AMA, and Old Ship. And surrounding this area is what is community developed. And they are the backbone that bring the school to Montgomery. And so the school opened, and then someone decided to file a lawsuit. Ellsbury versus Say. Say is the governor. And the state Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs that money from the Common School Fund cannot be used for the higher education of Blacks. So the school goes 3 years without any financing. Mary Frances Terrell, one of the students and later teacher at Alabama State, said it was a time to pray and pay. So Patterson would visit all of the churches, collect money to keep the school open. Finally, in 1889, the Alabama legislature took away the university designation, and it reverted back to a normal school. So here we are, 1890s. But remember I told you about the 1862 Land Grant Act. The 1890 Land Grant Act meant to provide the same inducement as the 1862 Morrell Land Grant. But this one would be aimed at historical Black colleges and universities. Here in Alabama, there were Tuskegee Institute and Alabama A&M and State Normal. And there's a tremendous battle over this land grant. William Hooper Council, who had changed political parties, he had gone from a radical Republican to a conservative Democrat. He outmaneuvered Patterson and Washington, and through the aid of fighting Joe Wheeler, Alabama A&M got the designation. Washington, not to be outdone, went out and hired George Washington Carver and got the extension service at Tuskegee. So that's in a nutshell. Patterson is still fighting for the school. Then the 1901 constitutional issue comes up, and the streetcar boycott downtown Montgomery, the passing of an ordinance that was transferred to the buses in 1936. That's what brought Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. But all of this is going on. Patterson is still fighting. Then the administrative building burns down in 1904. And luckily they had insurance, and it happened. But also, with Alabama passing a law mandating a high school in every county in the state, of course, white high school, the Slater Fund, the other philanthropists came up with the concept of establishing training school I went to the Ottawa County Training School. It was more acceptable from white conservative. It was not a threat. So we see secondary education, starting with Parker High School in Birmingham, and of course the normal schools at A&M, Huntsville, and Tuskegee, and Montgomery. So you go through this fight, and finally in 1920, the dreams of the Marion Nine would be fulfilled by establishing a junior college. And in 1928, Bibb Graves and Harper Council Trenton established a four-year institution, and Alabama State became the premier teacher education institution in the nation. It produced teachers, teachers, teachers. It became known as the Teachers College. But that's the 20th century. And of course, the history is intermingled with the Civil Rights Movement, Fred Gray, Tuskegee Airmen. I need to point that out to you. The first casualty was a state normal graduate, Tuskegee Airmen, believe it or not, Sherman White. He attended the Lab High School and then went to the University of Chicago. The Laboratory High School was established in 1915. It was a trial balloon, one of the best by John Beverly. It was the first Black high school in the state to become accredited, to show you. And of course, the high school produced scholars like Percy Julian, the noted chemist, lawyers, you name it. But the best summary, and I'll close and take question from you, is okay, sorry. And I put that on vibrate from here. So what Judith writes is that this school is instrumental in establishing the Black middle class, not only in Montgomery, but Marion and all over the state and the United States. Without the school, the economic advancement of this city and the state would be less than what it is today. And the legacy of the school, not only does it concern civil rights, but the concept of self-improvement is there. And it is a wonderful story. And I urge all of you to read this book, because if you read the book, you're reading the history of Black education in the state of Alabama and how it came about. Thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I hope I didn't ramble too much. Question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And to our virtual audience, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the comments below. I'll be able to get it and ask it on your behalf. But I wanted to start with a question that that I had, but also as your work as an archivist. I don't know if you know, October is Archives Month.
Yes.
And so as an archivist and as someone who kind of helped uncover this story in an archive, can you tell us what the importance of archives is in preserving our history and in telling our history?
Of course, my view, shaped by my experience here. It's a big difference between primary sources and secondary sources. Secondary sources mean someone's writing their opinion and their research, but to get to the actual source, that's a treasure that we can't deny. And I know we're living in an electronic age. No one's writing letters anymore, keeping a diary. We're losing very important things. But the archives, thank God, thank for Thomas Stewart Owens, and my experience with the Air Force Historical Research Agency, it allows you to bring an era to life, to bring an individual to life, to be able to analyze what is going on at that particular moment. Now, we get into this period of judging things by today's standard. What is this called? I can't remember the term, but archives are paradise to the people who are interested in their past. And it could start with genealogy. I'm a genealogy buff. I still have questions after 50 years of research. But your community, your institution, your church, your school, the information is here or at the National Archives or some university archives or church archives. So the importance of archiving is our whole memory exists from the archives. That's the sign at the National Archive, history is epilogue. I think that's what I remember reading that when I was at the National Archives downtown. Did I answer your question, Alex?
Yes, you did. Wonderfully, yes. I have another question about, because you talked about the nine, the original nine, and I know that some of them came here to Montgomery. Did they all come here to Montgomery when it moved? And where does their stories end? Do they continue to find other colleges or education?
Most of the original founders died before the institutions moved to Montgomery. Curtis dies in a buggy accident in 1878. James Childs dies in 1869. But their descendants follows the school to Montgomery. Stephen Childs is one. And of course, when the college leaves Marion, they re-stand up the school, Lincoln. And this is where I run into reading Harsh Man Bond. He was puzzled by the number of Black doctorates in this one location. And it was from the Lincoln School, which existed up until 1969 when it was closed down. But it started back up as a private school connected to the Congregational Church. And in the 40s, I believe, the public took over the school. But some of the school is unbelievable. And they, as I told you earlier about the development of the Black middle class. So we have to include the school left in Marion as well as school moving to Montgomery. It is quite a story.
Definitely. So I'm sorry, I just got in a couple of... Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. I was looking at the question, trying to figure out which one was the question, because there's a lot of wonderful comments about your amazing lecture. I understand you attended a Rosenwald school in Independence. Is there any relationship between the Rosenwalds and ASU? And this is from Darlene Lynn.
Yes. Back to Booker T. Washington, back to the support of the philanthropists. The Rosenwald, Sears and Roebuck, with Booker T. Washington Tuskegee, started building schools. Normally, these are two-room schools, and I attended an elementary school, a Rosenwald school, where the first, second, and third grade was in one room. The fourth, fifth, and sixth grade was in the next room. And after we left there, we go to the training school. So I did participate, go to school at a Rosenwald school in Independence and Friendship. And believe it or not, no AC, a big pot, deli stove, outdoor toilet, but we learned. Unbelievable. We learned to love to learn. That's what was inspired in us at those Rosenwald schools. And there are still some schools. The training school in Otago started out as a Rosenwald school. Most of your training schools will be tied to Rosenwald. And again, this is funding from the family of the Sears and Roebuck family. And if you want to identify the schools at Fisk University, they list all of the Rosenwald schools. And I think in Alabama, there was over 120 Rosenwald schools.
Perfect. If we might have another question that comes in. If we do, then I'll ask that. But if not, then this is my final question that I have for you.
Go ahead.
So you explained so wonderfully why they came to Montgomery, because of the community that really brought them here. Was there any benefit to being in Montgomery, to being so near the state government? Did that help ASU at all or hinder it in any other way? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Initially, yes, because Thomas Say knew Patterson while he was in Greensboro. So Say was an advocate, and I inject this, a mob developed when Say was about to sign the papers to accept the school over an editorial that a black newspaper man, Justice C. Dukes, wrote. Thanks, Dr. Jones, for introducing that to me. He wrote an editorial about after witnessing a black being lynched on Dexter Avenue and bullet-ridden body. Basically, he was involved in the mayoral city election, and they opposed the election of Reese, who the black community demanded black police. So the mob developed, and Duke is forced out of Montgomery, and he moves to Pine Bluff and later St. Louis, and Dr. Jones tracks him all the way to Cuba in the Spanish-American War. But these incidents will come up, and just like with Nat Turner, all blacks will be blamed for the action of one. And many believe this was not, education should not be used. Blacks should not be educated because it produced people like Justice C. Dukes. And that's created that hardship. But eventually it led to the court case and more hardship. But paternalistic whites like Thomas Goode Jones, the governor, intervened. So there were paternalistic whites who aided the school and provided funding for it when it was not available. So Jones stands out. Who are the other families? The Joseph family, whose money built Birmingham. Scott, what's the banker? But Patterson ran such a smooth operation, no one knew he even had a school here unless you went out. And this is where the streetcars come in. Now you could catch the train, get on the streetcar, go to State Normal. And if you lived in Centennial Hill, catch the streetcar to come to work on Monroe Street, the Black Business District. The school is functioning, but yet funding, the role, the type of education, it will continue all the way up until even today. We see it in the Knight versus State of Alabama, the higher education case. We see it with the first reestablishment of the Independent Board of Trustees in 1976. So again, there is still coexistent, but yet tenuous existent. Did I answer that?
Yes, no, you did. And if no one else has any questions, then I think that will go ahead and conclude. But thank you so much for this amazing presentation that both expands our knowledge on ASU specifically, but also on Black education and the history of Reconstruction and so much more in this time period.
I can go on and on, Alex, but I won't ramble. I work better from questions, guys. I can be more specific. But wonderful. I'm proud of it, even though we're getting more interest in the Tuskegee Airmen globally. But this book tells the story of this Black institution. It could be the story of Alabama A&M, Talladega, Tuskegee. It's similar. The journey is similar.
Well, thank you so much. And everyone remember that you can buy this book in our museum store and you can have it online. The link is in the comments. And thank you so much to Mr. Caver. And I hope to see everyone back here virtually next month on October 18th when Jim Baggett will present on the attempted lynching of Jim Brown. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having me.